Hi everyone, my name is Natalie. Today I wanted to do my June wrap-up. I'll start off talking about the two books that I don't own, so that are not part of my physical TBR. The first one is Inferno by Catherine Cho, which is a memoir about the author experiencing a postpartum psychosis. So she had her son. A few weeks later, she decides to, together with her husband and her son, to travel to the US from the UK where they live. To visit relatives and friends and family. During this time, she falls down in a spiral of psychosis and is put into involuntary treatment. So the book starts with her being in the psych ward, and we get to understand the environment within the psych ward's walls and sort of the way that it has its own structure with its own set of rules and what you're expected to do in this place. For example, the unwritten rule that you don't really ask someone why they are there from the other patients there. And the further we get into the book, the more we learn about her own story, her story up to this point, as well as the actual lead up to the psychosis and the experiences of her going down the spiral. I found this to be a really interesting book. I have mentioned before that I find mental illness writing is something that I've been exploring in the last, I want to say 2 years maybe, and I'm always finding that I'm learning through that. And I think with this book, obviously a part of it is talking about motherhood and also the way that motherhood is viewed through a cultural lens. So she's talking specifically from a South Korean heritage point of view. But there's also other things related to the psychosis and the treatment of mental illness, the rights of the patient, the experiences of involuntary treatment, what a hard experience that can be, to lose your agency and your right to make your own decisions about your own life, to be in a situation where you don't exactly know how to get out, and to sort of be forced to perform in a certain way to be perceived as well enough to get out. I thought this was fantastic and yet another memoir that I really enjoyed. The other book I read from my library was Two Trees Make a Forest by Jessica J. Lee, and this is one of the ones that I have been planning to read for Springathon and finally got around to. So this is a memoir where the author explores her heritage of Taiwan, as well as talking about Taiwanese history and its landscape and climate and geography, and talking about her own life and her family's life. So it's a weave of different stories. A lot of the things that stand out to me in Jessica J. Lee's writing is the way that she explores language and identity and culture and the way that these things shape our worldviews. Part of it is that the language aspect and the knowing of the language being a way to access stories of your family and of your ancestry, and to be able to claim that as something that is your own. But also she talks about language in the sense of how a language reflects the ideas of the country. What language tells us about the relationship between people and land in a particular context, in a particular social and cultural and historical context. One of the things that she comes back to again and again is the question of identity in the sense of someone who, especially as a biracial person, how she places herself in connection to Taiwan as someone who has grown up in other countries and where her connection to Taiwan is mostly indirect. My complacency, I know now, was a privilege afforded by my distance, by the ease of light skin and futures that passed for whiteness. I do not know why we did not visit Taiwan during my childhood, and I never asked. Instead, I negotiated the world as a dual citizen of Britain and Canada, casting my life in those frames of reference. The question of whether to call myself Taiwanese or Chinese felt a complication too far. I often find myself with too many names, too many homes, and no fixed sense of which order to arrange them in. A use of just one was an erasure of another. So I think there's that sort of complicated and almost a guilt-ridden thing in terms of how much she has claimed or hasn't claimed this part of her identity, how she navigates that, especially when she's meeting her grandparents on her mother's side, and how the language barrier is another thing that influences how she thinks about this identity aspect. Continuing on with the nature theme, I have read The Eternal Season Ghosts of Summer Past, Present and Future by Stephen Rutt, which I got from the publisher Elliott and Thompson. It was published on the 1st of July. So this is a book talking about summers, the various birds and wildlife that sort of come to the forefront in this season. It talks about the ways that the natural world has changed with climate change and the ways that we're seeing things now as a warning of things to come. So in one example is when he's talking about bird species that used to migrate to other parts of the world decide to stay in one location all year round. Their behavior is changing because of the landscape's changing. The thing he makes the point of in the book is that this season makes it particularly clear how the wildlife is doing. Our summer wildlife is the filter through which we can see what's really happening in our seasons. It's a time when nature is buzzing with activity, breeding, migration, feeding frenzies, all on show for us to see how our species are faring. In the title we have Ghosts of Summer Past, and that is a big focus point of the beginning of the book, where he talks about all of the species we have lost, all of the changes that are already inevitable and that we don't really have any power to turn around anymore. He talks about the beauty of the season of summer when everything comes to life, to be observing what is happening around us and to find comfort in that as well. Especially in troubling times when this book covers last year, so the first summer of the pandemic. And so he does talk about the pandemic somewhat, and also the ways he is trying to find comfort and grounding in exploring nature. I think there is also a tone of hope in the book, in seeing the positive signs of things that we have done and has led to good results, and giving us a sense of direction of where we should be heading if we want to see proper change. Last of my nature reading is Spirals in Time, The Secret Life and Curious Afterlife of Seashells by Helen Scales. I started reading this during the springathon and just finished it in the beginning of June. So this is talking about, again, sort of a myriad of things, but especially about seashells and all of the marine life that create them, what purpose they serve for them, but also the way that they've, what purpose they've served for humans as money or as jewelry. So it's a mix of nature description in terms of marine life, and talks about mollusks and about specific species within that, and talks about the health of our marine life as well. So it also goes into some criticism related to environmental change. One of my favorite chapters was the one about sea silk. It's in the chapter Spinning Shell Stories. This book also goes into some local traditions and the knowledge preserved in those kinds of communities that I really enjoyed learning about. Another thing I really enjoyed in this one was to learn about new species that I'd never even encountered before, such as the sea angel and the sea butterfly, these two. It's just kind of fascinating to read about marine life because there's always so much to learn. Again, there's some environmental commentary in the book and talks about the ways that we can change things to become more sustainable for the future. Next is the last of the nonfiction I read in June, and that is Miyazaki World by Susan Napier. Susan Napier goes through Hayao Miyazaki's career, starting from the very earliest works before the Studio Ghibli was even established, and goes forward into time, into the present, and all of the movies that he's known for and all of the lesser works that he's been involved in. And through going through all of these works, we also learn about his life and about the way that his life has influenced the work that he is known for, her actual analysis of the movies and what they're doing and why they have become so popular and have touched so many people so deeply, I think was really convincing. Being brave to go against the grain in the stories that he told, in centering women, female characters, in telling stories about environmental change, and challenging some of the ideas of the Japan in which he was creating these movies, to convey the perspective of a child. There's so many things that makes Miyazaki one of a kind, that makes him unique in movie production. And I think Napier's commentary really shows that. So I loved her conclusions. If you are a fan of Miyazaki, this is definitely something you should put on your list. Lastly, we have 3 novels. So we have Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. I finally finished this in the beginning of June, that I've been reading with Loren, and I will link her in the description. This is a historical fiction book set in towards the end of the 19th century in New Zealand, and it's about a group of men who become entangled in a mystery related to one man's death and another man's disappearance. And so they are very different types of characters. Many of them are involved some way in the gold digging happening in New Zealand at the time, but they all have different occupations and different interests in regard to the mystery, and they have it's sort of a complicated web of relationships in the book that we spend at least the first 300 pages just learning about all of the different characters, all of their backstories, all of the ways that they connect with each other. Towards the middle of the book, you get into the nitty-gritty of the mystery, and that is really fun to follow and see the way that everyone has different agendas, everyone is working towards their own gains and goals, and sometimes they do things that is not necessarily even beneficial for themselves, just because they sort of end up in these tight corners and they act without thinking. And because we are following so many different characters, we see different viewpoints as well, and we see the way that one character's decision will affect the others. So it's a really fun and wide scope to follow, and once all of the characters are established and all of the players are established, it's fun to just see the way that they move across the board. I found the actual conclusion to be kind of a letdown. The ending wasn't big enough to make up for all of the work that had happened in the previous sections, and it just falters slightly towards the end. Next is the book I read for Peru for Invisible Cities, and that is The World of the Speechless by Julio Ribeyro, translated by Catton. Most of the stories were published between the 1950s and the 1970s. There is one story called The First Snowfall, which is probably my favorite out of them, and it's talking about a man who I can't remember exactly if it's a friend or someone acquainted to him, and the protagonist of the story helps him out in doing various things, like in allowing this other man to crash in his apartment, and later he allows him to eat from his food, and then he continues to give more and more access to his things and more rights to his stuff, until eventually he almost takes over his life, and it's just this gradual feeling of something being off and of a sort of disaster waiting to happen, and it's just a really interesting psychological story. Again, with a surreal aspect to it, and I found a lot of the stories to be very cinematic. Often they have like an outsider perspective. There's one story, for example, where a man has inherited a piece of land from his father, and then he tries to live in that place, but he is so disconnected from the other inhabitants in the area. It's a story with a quite sad undertone, the way that it explores his disconnect from, on the one hand, his father and the locals, but also on the other hand, not being really able to move back to where he came from, because he'd already made this decision to move. So I think it has a lot of interesting characters and a lot of interesting situations that they find themselves in. The last book I wanted to talk about now is an I-novel by Miyazaki, and this was translated by Julia Carpenter in collaboration with the author. It takes place over the course of one day in the 1980s in the US, and it follows a protagonist who is Japanese, and she moved from Japan to the US with her family 20 years prior to the start of the novel, and she is coming to terms with the decision that she wants to move back to Japan after finishing her PhD and her studies. She no longer has a reason to stay, and she's always really meant to go back to Japan. Things that I particularly enjoyed in this is what I enjoy with Miyazaki other book, and that is the exploration of language. So there's some commentary that is exploring the character's decision to continue using Japanese and when they start using English and what that means, how they relate to their heritage and how they're sort of letting go of their heritage and their right to return to Japan when they're losing that side of them. And it's interesting because in this book the sisters sort of make different decisions regarding that. The protagonist is constantly trying to hold on to Japanese, and it almost comes off as being a protective mechanism, as a way to make sure that she has a place to return to. There's one passage that talks about language, and I think again something I mentioned in regard to Jessica J. Lee's book, where language reflects something about the country from which it comes. The Japanese word for white person, hakujin, sounded strange coming from her lips. I realized that though I used the English word without compunction, I too hardly ever used hakujin, and certainly not with nanae. Japanese people basically had no need for such a race-specific word. When Europeans first reached Japanese soil from the southern sea to conduct trade or spread the gospel, the term Namban, southern barbarians, came into use, following Chinese tradition. Then as Japanese people saw more Europeans with their own eyes, they called them Komohekigan, the red-haired and blue-eyed. Finally, after the country opened its doors to the world, the notion of the West, Seiyo, was introduced along with the word Seiyojin, Westerners. That word took some root in the language, but a simpler expression became common in speech, Gaijin, outsider. So there's that whole talk about how something that is taken for granted in one language isn't necessarily the same in another language, and how those differences are inform us about a cultural difference as well. That was all I wanted to say in this June wrap up. I would love to know if you've read any of these books or if you're interested in reading any of them, or what you read in June. I would love to hear about your highlights of the month. And that was all I wanted to say. I hope you're doing well and you're taking care of yourselves, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.